Hello, I'm Michael Cantrell, and you are listening to the Prison Officer Podcast, a place to have a conversation about the forgotten cops that work in this country's jails, prisons, and correctional centers. A place for me to try to make sense of a career spent working inside the fence with some of the greatest people that nobody sees or recognizes for the important job they do to keep this world safe. If you love this podcast, hit the follow button, or better yet, share with your family, friends, or coworkers. In more than 28 years of corrections, I have used or supervised pepperball hundreds of times. Now, as a master instructor for pepperball, I teach others about the versatility and effectiveness of this pepperball system. From cell extractions to disturbances on the rec yard, pepperball is the first option in my correctional toolbox. One of the most dangerous times for officers is during cell extractions. Pepperball allows officers to respond with the lowest level of force and still be effective and ready if the situation escalates. The responding officer controls where the projectiles are aimed, how many projectiles are launched, and how rapidly they're deployed. This allows the response to be tailored to the moment. To learn more about Pepperball, go to www.pepperball.com or click the link below in the show's information guide. Pepperball is the safer option first. Well, welcome back to the Prison Officer Podcast. Today, I'm doing a remote interview, and I just happened to be in the old warden's house across from the Missouri State Pen, built in 1888, and have a special guest today. As most of you know, I started at Missouri State Pen, and whenever you talk about Missouri State Pen in Missouri, you can't help but mention Mark Schrieber. He went to work for the Missouri Department of Corrections in the late 70s, held many positions starting as an officer, and he ended his career as an assistant warden of the Missouri State Penitentiary. He's always been an advocate for preserving history of MSP and the Missouri Department of Corrections. He's also an author who's written 2 books, one of them called Somewhere in Time, and then Shanks to Shakers. And that since then, he has been city councilman. So please welcome one of my former bosses, Mr. Mark Schrieber. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Mike. I will make one correction off the bat.
Absolutely.
Deal, but it kind of dates myself. I actually started at the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1968.
Oh, wow.
As a college student. So
okay.
I started in 68, and so that kind of predates me a little bit there. So,
What'd you do as a college student? Was it an internship or something?
No, I actually needed a job. My parents were both educators, and of course, we know how much money they always made. So they said, well, you really need to have a job. And so I started here when I went to Lincoln University, and I ended up then going up to Central Missouri State University later on. But I went to work. I went to work here as a corrections officer. And, I remember a fellow named Jess Elliott hired me. He was the deputy warden at the time.
Wow.
And he asked me, he said, well, let me ask you a question. He said, are you afraid of inmates? And I said, I don't know. And he said, what do you mean you don't know? And I said, well, I've never been around any.
Right.
And I had an uncle that had been a federal prison warden and retired from the federal system, actually down at Springfield was his last tour of duty. And so I went to work there, and I was dumber than a rock.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I was the same way. Yeah. I had never been to jail, never been to prison.
Yeah.
This was my first time. So, yeah. So you talked a little bit about from Springfield. So let's talk about where you grew up and where you're from and a little bit about that.
I was born in Springfield in 1946 at the old St. John's Hospital. And my dad was originally from Branson, but grew up in Springfield, where his dad was a city engineer back in the 1920s and 1930s. And my mother was from Springfield. I grew up on a farm there. So I had a lot of family there. But I was born there in 1946 and went to Delaware School, grade school.
Yeah.
And then also went for a little while down at Nixa because my mom taught down at Nixa. And then we moved to Jefferson City in 1954 when my dad took a job, was asked to take a job with the State Department of Health. Mm-hmm. And he came up here from Springfield, and that's how we relocated here. So we were actually here. I was in the 3rd grade then, and we were here about, I think, 2 weeks before the prison riot. And after the prison riot happened, my mom and dad said, well, maybe we should go back to Springfield. but but we stayed. So I grew up,
Right.
went through the Jeff City schools, graduated from Jeff City Senior High in 1964,
Right.
and then later on went to college and eventually got a degree in business and in criminal justice, and then I got a master's degree later from Columbia College in criminal justice
Wow.
and corrections. So.
Yeah. You mentioned a grandfather that worked in Springfield at
Mhm.
the Federal Medical Center.
That was actually my uncle.
Uncle. Okay.
That was my Charlie James, and he also had a pawn shop that his dad started on Commercial Street called Commercial Street Pawn Shop.
Okay.
And my uncle Charlie, who was from Springfield,
Mm-hmm.
and he married my mother's sister, who's still alive, my last remaining aunt, and she now lives down in Lubbock, Texas, where her son's a professor
Wow.
down there. But anyway, my grandfather Schreiber on my dad's side was the city engineer down there,
Mm-hmm.
and for a long time. In fact, you probably heard of the Young Brothers massacre down there.
Yep.
Well, a story that my dad told me, and he introduced me to this fella. My dad was a twin,
Mm-hmm.
and my uncle Henry, who died at age 101
Wow.
in Springfield. Uh, uh, my dad was a twin, and so they had two friends, and they were Ray and Faye Oliver. And Ray and Faye Oliver were my dad lived over on Central at the
Mm-hmm.
time, and when they lived over there, my dad said that Ray and Faye Oliver's dad was a city detective. His name was Tony Oliver,
Mm-hmm.
and so Dad would keep up with them even and later on when I was a full grown adult, and he would go down there and talk to his friend Ray Oliver and all. Well,
Sure.
whenever the Young Brothers massacre happened down there, my dad said that Ray and Faye were over at their house on my dad's house on Central. And he said he remembered my grandmother, Schreiber, who was originally from Branson. She came out in the back, and they had a barn back behind their house. And she said, Ray and Faye, you need to go home right away. And Dad said, us being kids, we just kept on playing in the barn and everything. And finally, he said, my grandmother came out and said, I mean, you need to go home right now.
Mm.
And they got home and they found out that their dad had been killed in the Young Brothers massacre. Tony Oliver was
Wow.
one of the 6 officers killed in
Yep.
that event. And of course, those guys had done time up here. The Young Brothers had done time here at
Absolutely.
MSP. And of course, they caught up with them down in Texas, and they never made it back here because they took care of them down there
Right.
in
Right.
the gun battle. So, but that was that was quite a nationally known event, because that was the
Absolutely.
highest number of officers that had ever been killed
Yeah.
that particular event. So.
Isn't it interesting the way history works in little circles?
Yeah, it
Wow.
is. I don't know if you ever knew a fellow named Paul Young.
Yep.
Well, Paul, uh, when I was a little kid, before I ever knew him,
Mm-hmm.
when later on, when Paul worked at MSP, and he was still alive a couple of years ago.
He still is. I'm
Okay.
looking to interview him maybe
When you
coming
do,
up.
I want you to give him my phone number because I want to talk to Paul. Paul was at MSP.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Paul showed me a picture one time when I was down at Ozark Correctional Center, and I went out to his house
Mm-hmm.
and for lunch, and he got this picture, and it showed Paul, and he had been a Springfield motorcycle officer, police officer.
Yep.
And back when I was a little kid, they had some cobras that got out of a pet store, and that was a big deal.
Right.
These cobras, and Paul had killed one of those cobras, and he was holding it up. And so we got to talking, and he said, Mark, have you ever heard of the Young Brothers massacre? And I said, yes. And he said, well, let me tell you. And I told him my story that I just told you.
Sure.
And he said, well, let me tell you my story. He said, when I applied to be a Springfield police officer, he said, they grilled me upside down and backwards, wanted to know if I was related to the Young Brothers. And I kept telling them, no, no. They said, well, we'll find out if you are.
Yeah.
And he said, of course, they found out I was not. And he said,
Mm-hmm.
I said, so I got hired. He said, otherwise, I don't think I'd have got a job.
Wow.
So, that's a
Yeah.
true story.
Paul was a longtime major at the Ozark
Yes,
Correctional
right.
Center. Yeah, I worked for
Really
him for a
good
little
officer.
while. Yeah. Yeah, I'll tell him you said hi. We'll do that. So, um, so you had a little bit of knowledge ahead of time of prison. You had a couple of family members that had worked in it. Did they talk about it, or was it still just brand new to you when you walked through the door?
Well, you see something, or back then, of course, they didn't have anything much on TV about anything
Mm-hmm.
like that or whatever. you obviously had heard of Alcatraz and places like that. Uh, my uncle Charlie actually started out as a coach, and the first prison he worked as an officer was at Leavenworth, and he got a job, at Leavenworth. But my cousins, including my aunt that I was telling you about, her son that's a professor down at Lubbock at
Right.
the university down there, who was from Springfield. My cousins, of course, every time my uncle would get promoted, they moved. They went to Longpauc, California, Ashland, Kentucky, Terre Haute, Indiana.
Sure.
He made the rounds, and he'd keep getting promoted. Well, my cousins would always talk about living on the reservation, and I thought, reservation? Well, you're not Native Americans, And finally, I found out that it was government housing that they lived in, with all these different assignments that my uncle had. But, he talked a little bit about it, and he talked about some people they had from the RICO Act. And later on, he knew Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, and he didn't have much good to say about him.
Right.
He said he had known Machine Gun Kelly. And he knew, a lot of underworld figures, that were in the various facilities around.
Sure.
Of course, Stroud was down at Springfield. And but anyway, I when I came to work, if it hadn't been, I think one of the people that helped me the most, and I've talked about some of these people in my book that'll come out in the spring. Called my latest book will be called Forgotten Shadows.
Okay.
And it's due out when the tour season starts, about April. And a fellow named Leroy Casey, Captain Casey, he was from down at the Branson area, and I didn't know that till years later. But he helped me more than anybody. And I remember one time I tried to count a hall, and see, back then, back in the '60s, late '60s, and even the early '70s. We had inmate clerks, inmate levermen. We had the inmate levermen until Lieutenant Atkinson was killed in 1975. And so I tried to count a hall, and I want to tell you, I had the biggest mess. After about the third time, Captain Casey came over, and I thought, boy, I'm in trouble now.
Right.
But he actually helped me. And he got things squared away, and he told some of the inmate clerks, okay, one of them was named Cluck. The Cluck family was notorious. The whole family came to prison. They made it a family reunion for the Clucks.
Right.
And so, then he got things squared away, and then I was able to do the counts. But, if it hadn't been for some of those people, and Casey was one of my favorites, I don't know what would have happened.
Right.
But there's something about it that, even though, later on I was the first undercover narcotics officer for the sheriff's office here.
Okay.
And I was an undercover narcotics officer when I was working at the prison, and the warden didn't know it.
Interesting.
Warden Swinson was the warden then, and he'd come from the federal system as well. And my cover story was, I just show them my prison ID, and my cover story was with these people who I was a corrections officer taking narcotics into the prison, and they sold to me. And they didn't know until roundup time that I was actually an undercover narcotics officer. And then later I was a chief investigator for the sheriff and the prosecutor here. And that's before we had corrections investigators. I was the first official one in 1983.
Here at MSP?
They hired me in '83 as the first internal affairs officer, the chief investigator for the whole department. And Dale Riley was the deputy director of DAI then, and he's the one that actually got that position through under the merit system. And, but before that, then what I did with the sheriff and the prosecutor, they had authority in this county over any crimes that happened at Algoa, MSP, or Church Farm. And so I would work all those crimes. So I got an education real fast in working. Lieutenant Atkinson's homicide, I worked that along with some fellows from the patrol, a couple that are still friends of mine. And then, of course, in 1979, Walter Farrell was killed, and I worked Walter's. Took pictures of Walter when he died in the prison hospital. Then later on in 1983 is when, it was in July, July the 3rd is when Officer Tom Jackson was killed up at Moberly.
Mm-hmm.
and I worked
Yeah.
his. That was members of the Aryan Brotherhood that killed him.
Wow.
So I mean, I learned pretty fast,
Yeah.
you know.
Some tough cases there.
Well, and I had a lot. We had a lot of good staff that helped, and the sheriff Basinger was a great sheriff to work for. I loved working for him, and but I spent a lot of my time at the prison
Mm-hmm.
working, a lot of different cases. That wasn't the only thing I did because I was with the sheriff's department,
Sure.
But it was, I learned a lot.
Yeah.
I did. So,
So over those years, what do you think one of the biggest changes was that you saw?
well, I guess I'll probably think of something later on, but I think it kind of went from I didn't really think about this till later, but then what you find out is the more you learn, the more you find out you don't know.
Right.
And I guess that's what keeps me even at, I'll be 77 in February, why I'm still so interested, because just like the tours now,
Mm-hmm.
I learned something from people that may say, well, my grandfather worked there way back when, and, I've got this picture you might like to see. And I
Mm.
thought, holy Toledo, that's really interesting.
Right.
But I think that some of the biggest changes were the fact that when I came to work, the people that worked there were dedicated,
Mm-hmm.
but there wasn't that degree of professionalism that we tried to establish later on.
Right.
And,
Right.
it's always bothered me that when I came to work, corrections staff in Missouri were the lowest paid in the United States, and they still are.
Yeah.
That still bothers me.
Yeah.
And I think that later on, of course, when I came to work, MSP was the only maximum security prison run by the state of Missouri.
Right.
See, then, and Mobley was a medium security prison that opened, I think, in the 1960s,
Right.
64, 65.
Mm-hmm.
So when I came to work, uh, we still had the reception diagnostics center was at MSP,
Right.
H Hall.
Mm.
Later on, I was a lieutenant over H Hall in some of those places. So, I think that Missouri, one of the things that Missouri did right is that much later, whenever we started recognizing that we were going to have some overcrowding, Missouri started building all prisons as maximum security prisons.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, and as other corrections professionals know, you can always lower the custody level, but you can't. It's damn hard to go back and retrofit something
Yeah.
from minimum to maximum.
Right.
So Missouri did something right there.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I might be getting ahead of myself, but I'll forget it if. One of the things that does bother me a little bit, I think now they're hiring like 19-year-olds.
Yeah.
That bothers me a little. And
Yeah.
it's not because that young people aren't maybe that the fact that they I hope they're not just taking it as a job as so that they can just move on to something else.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. Uh, but as you know, young males can be very vocal,
Mm-hmm.
and they have the physical capabilities, but I wonder about the psychological capabilities
Or the communication
and the
skills.
communication skills. Yeah,
Yeah.
they don't know verbal judo.
Right.
And so, somebody gets in your face and they call you a no good this and no good SOB and everything, instead of you letting it roll off you like water off a duck's back and
Mm-hmm.
saying, have a good day, I'll see you later.
Right.
They'll get up in somebody's face, and the next thing you know, they have to call a white shirt, and the white shirt has to come and can intervene. And by that time, you've got this big crowd gathered around,
Mm-hmm.
and problems start.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying in every instance, but that worries me a little bit.
Yeah.
From that standpoint.
Yeah. I came in at 22 or just turned 22. And in many ways, I wasn't ready. I wasn't matured yet.
I was 20.
Yeah. And so 19 years old, my brain wasn't even anywhere towards being a professional and you walk in here and when I walked in here, there were guys who had been in prison longer than I'd been alive.
Absolutely.
So to stand up and give them commands or instructions, that was a tough thing to do. What do you, and I ask everybody this, do you remember the first time that gate shut behind you?
I do. And I think I probably thought, what am I doing here? And I knew several people that were later became police officers that worked there for a little while, and they absolutely could never get used to the gate
Yeah.
slamming behind them. And
Yeah.
they were good people,
Sure.
but they just couldn't. But I guess the thing that when I shut my eyes and think about it, I think the thing that really made me realize exactly where I was is back when I started, we didn't initially have portable radios.
Right.
We had that whistle.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to blow a whistle if you're trying to keep somebody from knocking you down.
Right.
And that long corridor that went all the way down
Mm-hmm.
to J&K Hall
Right.
and the other way to F&G Hall,
Yep.
that long corridor. And, if you were assigned to be down at the end down there, and you had to stand up on that little piece of metal that they had. Of course,
Yes,
I
sir.
always tell everybody I was 6'4" and got compacted down to 5'7", or whatever. But you had to stand, and you'd see several hundred inmates coming down there after mainline or whatever, and the next thing you know, something breaks out, somebody's getting stabbed or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
that drives it home the reality of where the heck you are.
Yes.
It
Yep.
really does.
That was a thing when I was, of course, it was several years later, but that was kind of the thing they did when you'd had enough time in, but they wanted to see if you had what it took.
Yeah.
And you'd go stand down there at the end of the long hallway there. And yeah, when you're standing there and it's a sea of men between you and help,
Right.
it puts it in perspective. It absolutely does.
Yeah, see, when I went through the training academy, it was over there where the old women's prison
Mm-hmm.
was, and of course the women had been up in H Hall when it was built. About the H Hall was built, or House Unit 1 was built at the time of about the 1904 World's Fair,
Mm-hmm.
and that was
Wow.
the female unit up there. And then in 1926, Warden Leslie Rudolph moved all the females out of MSP over to what they call the old Miner Mansion. And General James Miner was one of the first adjutant generals of Missouri, and his house stood right over there where the Department of Natural Resources building is
Okay.
now.
Yep.
They put the women there, and then in the 30s, when they did this big building program, when they built F&G and J&K and a lot of those structures, the hospital and the admin building and everything. Well, the women, they built a two-story building over there, and they attached it to that old mansion.
Mm-hmm.
And the women were there. Well, that's where we had our first training academy, and our firing range was down over the hill. And actually, I'm telling you, it was like a swamp down
Right.
there. And
just off next to the river.
It was off next to the river, and I mean, it was anything but it would never pass anybody's muster for a firing range today.
Right.
And we had an M1 carbine, which I wish I had one of those.
Yeah.
Had an M1 carbine, and every third round, I believe, was a tracer. We had a shotgun,
right.
pump shotgun, and we had a revolver.
Mm-hmm.
And that's those were the firearms that we actually had.
Yeah.
And, of course, years ago, where the whistle came about, way before my time, but on the towers, we had 16 towers, as you know.
Yep.
And that was the 16th one was the extra one up on top of the admin building. Well, the officers used to have to come out on the catwalk and blow the whistle every 15 minutes. And that's before they had the intercom system. And that's how they kept track of everything
yeah, everybody was awake and not under duress.
And of course, later on when I was there, they'd come around with the shift captain or the zone lieutenant, and it would depend on the degree of desire, I guess. That if it was a real cold day like today, the lieutenants that you really know you could depend on that would come around and put the flashlight on you. Fortunately, I didn't have to work very many towers.
Right.
I do remember one on Thanksgiving, about 1969 or 70. My wife and I were going to go to Galesburg, Illinois for Thanksgiving. And Captain Casey said, "Schrieber, I hate to put you on a tower, but we're short. We've had too many call-ins." So he put me down on 10 tower. And of course, during holiday, nothing's going on. All the factories are closed down there. Not, even the pigeons took a vacation,
Right.
and no cats, nothing. So then they called at the end of the shift and said, "We're really sorry, but you're going to need to stay over an extra 8 hours." So I worked on that tower 16 hours, and I
Mm.
actually got up and I'd go stand on the catwalk to stay awake because it was so that little heater would burn you up on the backside and the front side, and you were freezing. And so I worked then 16 hours on that tower, and then I got off. Of course, being only 20, 21. Then we drove to Galesburg, Illinois, in a snowstorm.
Wow.
You know,
Yeah.
but I remember the towers, and of course the lieutenant came around. Lieutenant Tandy Williams came around, and he shined the spotlight, and I flashed him back. So
Well,
he knew I was in an alert state, shall we
yes,
say?
absolutely.
So,
Yeah, I remember those days. So, well, let me ask you a question before I ask the next question. So one of the things that really put me in perspective when I came to work here was down in the training room. I think it's down below one building. Um, there was pictures of an inmate that we had taken every 10 years. Do you remember that?
It's downstairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you remember who that
Jay
inmate?
Bird Thurman.
Okay. He died up there in the hospital, I think, while I was working here. But that really put perspective to, because he'd spent his whole life here, hadn't he?
Jay Thurman. When I taught later on after when I retired, I taught for about 4 years as an adjunct professor
Mm-hmm.
at Columbia College in criminal justice and corrections. And one of the things that when you categorize various types of offenders,
Mm-hmm.
Jaybird is what you would call a colonist inmate. And a colonist inmate is an inmate that actually likes being incarcerated because they have that structure
Mm-hmm.
and they have that certain sense of security. Because Jaybird, I've got a picture of Jaybird that was taken in the 70s, maybe a little bit later, maybe it was in the early 80s, and he is with Slick Stidham, and who did time in Alcatraz, and
Mm-hmm.
Slick was one of the ringleaders of the '54 riot, with Ray Malance and a lot of those guys, and they're all gathered around him, and he's down in front, and they're gathered around Jaybird. Well, that was like his family,
Mm-hmm.
and actually, the first picture I think was taken in the 1920s.
Okay.
And when he first came to prison, he looked like a pretty tough guy back then.
Yeah.
But then you got this progression.
Mm-hmm.
And he would get out, come back, get out, come back.
Okay.
Well, I think the last time that he got out, he was sent to some kind of an assisted living facility.
Mm-hmm.
And the story that I was told, and I don't know for sure if it's accurate or not, but I've been told this by several people that he actually stole a nurse's purse, made sure that it was done where somebody would know that he did it, didn't take anything from the purse,
Right.
got violated, sent back to MSP because he knew that he was secure there and all of his friends were there
Yeah.
and he got along with all the staff. He knew he got 3 hots and a cot. That's what you call a colonist inmate.
Yeah.
And his series of pictures is down here in the museum.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. And I never heard of that as a colonist inmate. The Federal Medical Center there in Springfield has a lot of mental health that I would call colonist inmates.
Yeah.
They're very comfortable where they're at. And watching them over the years, I don't know that they could have lived as good a life on the outside.
Well, they could.
Because I would see them, I'd see them sit at picnic tables and have conversations, and neither one of them talking the same language, but they were comfortable in there.
I knew offenders and some of them one that got out, Joe Leedy, and I keep in touch with Joe, and I've known Joe for like 40, 45 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And, Joe made it on the outside, but I knew several guys that would sit down and say, well, tell me, what's it really like to drive a car? Now, and how do you do this? And you stop and think about it.
Right.
And I think maybe that's an area where we're a little bit lacking in trying to help some of these people that do go through the revolving door and maybe do stay out, because they're scared to death.
Yes.
They don't know how to fill out a job application. They don't know how to open a checking account.
Yeah.
Sometimes it worries me about with some of all the electronic devices, and my kids can do it, but I'm kind of trapped in the old world
Yeah.
myself to some degree.
If you've been in prison 10 years, you've
Right.
missed a lot of stuff
Well,
lately.
just in my adult life, look how fast things have progressed in
Hmm.
the electronic age. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
so that's very true.
I think one thing that I saw that was unique about Missouri State Pen, and you mentioned it, was this is where all the maximum security in Missouri were for a very long time.
Correct.
And, I went later on to the federal system. Well, inmates would get bounced around from institution to institution. You had guys here that had been here for years and years,
Correct.
decades. And so that was very unique to, um, I don't know, we called them convicts. There was a difference between convicts and inmates.
Yeah, and
And
the old guys wanted to be called a convict.
yeah, and you truly had some of those, they were just the dangerous, criminally educated convicts of the time. And a little piece of criminal history there, but at the same time, you looked in their eyes and you knew they were dangerous.
Right.
So
And one of the things when we talk about transition and how times change, when I came to work in corrections, of course, I knew a lot of guys that were there at the time of the '54 riot.
mhm,
So there's not that much time between '54 and '68,
right,
you know. Um, and the system was still trying to recover from that. Uh, but I also knew a lot of guys that had been in World War II and been in the Korean War.
mhm,
And the offenders back then were pretty much squared away. I mean, they wore their green uniform with the black stripe down the leg.
mhm,
They were pretty neat. Their uniforms a lot were pressed.
right,
A lot of them wore flat tops and crew cuts. You didn't see back when I initially started. They didn't have the long hair and everything.
right,
First of all, it wasn't allowed, but they still weren't that way. They were pretty much squared away.
mhm,
And I think a lot of those fellows that did fine in the military didn't do so well in society,
mhm,
and so but they did do okay in the prison system. They had a job. They always went to that job. They knew they had their little group of friends. They
mhm.
had their various activities,
Chow
the
3 days
sports they
times a day. Yeah.
did, and so I think that made a pretty much of a big difference. And see, until 1989,
Mhm,
1989 is when we got our second maximum security prison. By the way, after the '54 riot, the governor's commission that Governor Donnelly appointed to investigate the causes of the '54 riot, they actually recommended MSP be closed
hmm,
then.
right.
Well, I was in the third grade, and guess what? It went from the time I was in third grade till the time I was a deputy warden before we closed MSP
Right.
in September of 2004.
Yeah.
But in '89 was when we built the second maximum security prison, and that was down at Potosi.
Mhm.
And Paul Delo, who was a lieutenant with me at MSP, became the first warden.
Yep.
In fact, I just got a Christmas card from his widow the other day, and Sharon Delo and I are still very good friends
Excellent.
and stay in communication.
Yeah.
But that actually that's kind of how it was, And those MSP inmates, they when we moved from the old prison to the new prison
Mhm.
in 2004, I got to tell you, we had no real problem with moving the offenders. Everything went real smooth, and I'll tell you that was because of the dedication of the staff
Mhm.
and how much everything was worked out. Everything's in logistics, as you know.
Right.
That was all worked out. Other E squads, emergency squads came in. Everybody worked together.
Mhm.
There were no harsh words with anybody. Took 5,000 boxes to move the inmate property.
Wow.
And everybody, we worked with everybody. But once we got moved to the new place, guess what? The old guys didn't like it at all
Oh yeah.
because you'd think that because of the fact that MSP was the oldest continuously operating prison west of the Mississippi River, was
Mhm.
antiquated in every way, 19th century, early 20th century facility, you'd think that they would be tickled to death to move to the new institution. Not so,
Wow.
because too much structure.
Mhm.
All the housings were separate pods with
Well,
their separate little enclosed
it
area.
was built for a lot more security.
That's right. And
Yeah.
they did not like the new facility
Okay.
at all.
Interesting.
They liked they wanted to go back to the old place.
Yeah.
And they said as much.
What's the highest population you know of inside the walls here? I mean, I think we were over 3,000 when I was here.
There's some discrepancy over that.
Okay.
One time I heard that in the 1930s, it got close to 5,000.
Wow.
But you know, I think that when I was there, it was like 2,700,
Right.
something like that. Now, see, I was there when we integrated prison too. It was segregated when I started.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah,
Wow.
yeah. See, A-Hall was all African American inmates, uh, and it was segregated. And see, we integrated that prison about 1974. Don Warwick,
Yep.
who was best man at my wedding.
I'll be darned.
My wife and I have been married 45 years, and I did the eulogy at Don's funeral when he died. Don Warwick was hired by Warden Swenson, and Don was the chief of custody down at Ozark Correctional Center.
Yep. Yep.
Well, Don, and he was a captain. Well, Swenson brought him up here to Jeff City, and then Don got promoted to the deputy warden's position. Well, during that time, they had there was a lot of talk and discussion about the integration of prison, and I didn't know much about it because I was too far down the totem pole. But anyway, they had a lot of violence, and you know, there was the Aryan Brotherhood, but it was more on the lines of the Ku Klux Klan than the Aryan Brotherhood back then.
Sure.
You had the Black Panthers, some of those groups, the Maury Science Temple, you know, Maury Science Temple #1, which is kind of the outlaw temple.
So segregated yard also?
Not so much on the yard,
but housing.
People pretty well stayed to themselves in their own groups. There was a little bit of transition and intermixing there. But what happened was finally Don Warwick got everybody together, and he got these various inmate factions together. And he said, look, guys, if we don't integrate this prison, the federal government's going to come in and do it.
Yeah.
Now we've got to get it done. And so, by golly, he got it done.
Yeah.
Now, it didn't just happen overnight, but it did get done.
Right.
And then things gradually got better and better. And there were times when we had some pretty bad events that happened in various factions. But, you know, then you also had like people from different motorcycle groups and, you know, the St. Louis faction versus Kansas City faction. They never got along. But that kind of smoothed out over time.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Warwick was, for me in my generation here, I guess he was kind of like a legend. There were a ton of stories, and I don't know how many are true, but he was one heck of a warden here for a long time.
See, Don lived the warden's house. You know, I don't want to bore you with this, but anyway, the warden's house was down here at 722, which is just a couple of doors down. So back in the time when I was here, this was actually then the central office for corrections here for a period of time. Well, back at the time of the prison riot, and slightly before, the warden at the time of the prison riot was a fellow named Ralph Edson.
Okay.
Warden Edson was a lieutenant on the highway patrol, and he actually, I think, was in charge of their criminalistics laboratory.
Right.
Okay. Well, Governor Donnelly asked Ralph to be the warden, and Ralph said no. And I know this because Ralph's son John, who's still alive, talked to him last night. John's in his 80s. He was in my wedding, and we're still friends to this day. Well, John was when the riot happened. I think he was 16 or 17. I've got a picture of him in that somewhere in time book.
Right.
But anyway, Ralph Edson, John's dad, did not want to be the warden. And the governor said, look, Ralph, if you take it for 1 year, I will find somebody to replace you. That was in 1949. And the Edsons, Ralph agreed. He didn't want to upset the governor. So they moved in right down here at 722. I got a picture of them at Christmas time down there.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, John had a brother. John had one brother. His brother ended up getting killed in a car accident down in Springfield. But anyway, so they moved in. Well, guess what? Poor old Ralph ended up staying from 1949 till 1956 and had to go through the riot and all that, which really wasn't his fault. He said, he didn't know anything about being a warden. And I interviewed him when he was 92. And of course,
Right.
he was involved. He executed Hetty and Hall when they were the Greenleaf kidnappers and,
Yep.
was involved in a whole lot of different things. But, that was a big thing for them. And so then when Don Warwick came, then Don lived down there. And I can't tell you how many hours I spent at Don Warwick's house, even when I was with the sheriff's office and everything, talking about problems and potential problems and escape attempts and all the things that we dealt with.
Sure.
And I'd go over to Don's house, and I was there more than at my own house. That's no kidding. But yeah, he was. A lot of those guys. You ask yourself, well, would they have made it today? And the answer is probably they would not have.
Yeah.
But they had good common sense. They had good people skills.
Yep.
And they knew how to deal with that special factor. And Don Warwick, there's no doubt about it, whether people like him or dislike him or whatever, Don Warwick was 200% corrections.
Oh, yeah.
And Bill Armitrout was too.
Yeah. I think people don't realize sometimes that inmates have changed also. I mean,
Absolutely.
Administrations had to change because society changed, because inmates changed. Those guys were dealing with a level of criminals that we don't deal with right now.
Correct.
Yeah, I don't think people take that into account sometimes.
I actually had some. I'll try to be quick about this, but I actually had some of the older, more established offenders that came to me when I was a lieutenant, and they said, Mr. Schrieber, we want to tell you something. Do you know such and such, this person that had just come in? And they said, these younger people have no respect for anybody, and they have no respect for even themselves. And they said, we're just going to tell you, we're not really snitching on anybody as such, but if this person isn't removed from this unit or whatever, that person's going to end up dead because we're tired of them stealing from other offenders. And as you know, that was a no-no.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, so I would go to Don or somebody and say, well, here's what we need to do. And he'd say, well, get them moved then.
Right.
Because that was, there are those regulations among the inmate groups that you just don't break some of.
Absolutely. I think starting here was part of what made my career, because you learn really quick here. Being around, like we talked about, those old convicts. There were guards that were here that had been here for 30 years, and if you kept your ears open, you could learn a ton from those guys. And I was only here for 2 years at the Missouri State Pen before I moved on, but I really think a ton of what I learned in corrections happened in those 2 years.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
So talking to you here, I can already tell you have this great memory, and that's probably what's led you into being such a historian. But do you remember becoming the historian, or is it just something that just piecemealed together? How did you get so interested in salvaging all this?
History. Dad was actually a history teacher, and then later was with the Department of Education, but he was a history teacher. Taught down at Pipkin in Springfield, and he taught at Stratford, down in Stratford, Missouri as well. But I actually became a historian by accident. And what I found was, and I didn't get much support when I went to central office as Director Lombardi's assistant there, and then as the internal affairs officer. I found that corrections being next to the organization of our state government itself, like the General Assembly and the governor's office and all that, we're the oldest state department. We are the oldest.
Yeah.
Patrol didn't come on until the 1930s. Well, corrections, for example, MSP over here, MSP was 100 years old when Alcatraz opened as a prison. Yeah. Now Alcatraz existed, but it wasn't a prison. But the deal that I found is that too much was being thrown away. So I approached one of our public information officers, the central office, Laura Moore Adams. We're still good friends. She was down in the area of Herman, Missouri, at Marthasville. And I said, Laura, we need to, we need to do something with corrections history. And there was another young lady named Lori Stout, S-T-O-U-T, and Lori was a public information officer. And she was on board. Now, other people there said, oh, it can't be done. You can't do it, And so we said, yeah, we can. So I started working on the side and compiling this information. And I tell young people today, everybody's part of history. Whether we know it or not, we don't think of ourselves as being part of history, but we are. And so, and I was guilty of this. I didn't keep a diary or a log or anything. Now, I still had a lot of my reports and things like that from various criminal cases and testifying and things like that. But, how wonderful it would be if, and I don't think, corrections doesn't even have anybody now in the Missouri DOC that followed what I tried to get started and the others tried to get started. Well, I was hoping that somebody would come along and show an interest.
Sure.
So when we came out with the Somewhere in Time book, that Somewhere in Time book is outdated now because we've added new institutions like Licking and Charleston and some of those facilities. They didn't exist when we first wrote the Somewhere in Time book. And so then when I did the Shanks to Shakers book, I wanted to talk about a few more different things, some of the artwork and the contraband and some of those things. Right. And the Forgotten Shadows book, now I'm kind of concentrating on some of the staff people that I work with. You can't get everybody, and you always feel bad if you left somebody out, but I'm trying to deal with some of those issues. I guess you probably knew Mike Payne, didn't you? Did you know?
I know the name. I never met him.
Well, Mike he took over internal affairs after I left. Mike had originally been with Callaway County, and then later on he became the deputy warden up at Fulton Reception Diagnostic Center. Mike Payne called me when I was out at the new institution. He called me up one day. In fact, I actually hired Mike at central office. And Mike called me and he said, Mark, he said, over here at the Fulton Reception Diagnostic Center, he said, I found all these records and they've got them stored in a terrible place. He said, the mice have been eating on them and everything else. And he said, some of them are old ledgers from MSP.
Oh, wow.
Well, I remember back when I was a CO where they threw glass plate negatives away, old glass plate negatives from the 20s, and they dumped them in a trash barrel and they were taken to the dump.
Right.
Well, Mike said, and I have all of these inmate ID photos. And he said, they're getting ready to pitch this stuff. And I said, don't pitch it.
Wow.
So I got Marvin Cundiff, who was our inmate activities coordinator. Marvin's now deceased. I said, Marv, we're going to Fulton. And we got a van.
Right.
We went up to Fulton. We had to make 2 trips. We got 74 boxes of inmate photos that I stacked in my office out there at the new facility. I got all the ledgers years ago, the record was a ledger.
Yeah.
And they wrote it in longhand, where you were from, what you fell for, what your crime was, how much time you get. And then they might have a note out here to the side, died in prison hospital. Or, who knows, died of cholera.
Right.
Right. That was the record.
Wow.
It wasn't like what we have to do now. It looks like the Encyclopedia Britannica when you have everything on a computer or whatever.
Yep.
So I got all that stuff and I took it all to the state archives and gave it to them. And I said, this is stuff that we need to. So, and another thing I tried to do in the Somewhere in Time book, we didn't. Thank God for some of the secretarial staff over there. My secretary, Jan Elliott, and a bunch of other ladies over there, they went through and we took all of the employee records out of the Blue Book,
right,
going back as far as we could go. And we got like 30-some thousand names, and I'm sure we missed 15,000.
Right.
But they put those in alphabetical order. And those ladies did that to help Laura and I.
Mm-hmm.
And they put them in alphabetical order. Well, we also had, and I turned this over to the state archives, we didn't have enough room in the Somewhere in Time book, and I wish I could have, to put what their title was, their job title. We didn't have enough room, so we just had to list the employees.
Yep.
But all that exists at the state archives that we
Okay.
turned over to them. And I turned over all the original documents from that I put together, and I actually went through microfilm
Mm-hmm.
and at the archives, and microfilmed at the News Tribune here and at the Ellis Library in Columbia. And you know, as much microfilm as I could, and I read that.
Sure.
And that's when I had to start using glasses and the old script and all from newspaper articles and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we got a lot of our material. But it's just too bad that there isn't somebody that's still around that they can actually have to have one of the public information officers take that on as a project or whatever.
Yeah.
You know?
Just to save that stuff.
Yeah.
Because it's good, like you said, it's going to be history someday.
It is history.
Yeah.
History's being made every single day.
Yeah. So is that what they call the Mark Schrieber collection over at State Archives?
A lot of it. And what I did is and I bought a lot of stuff on eBay. I bought hundreds of pictures. People gave me photographs, and old employees gave me photographs of Warden Swenson when he was alive, Don Warwick, and those guys gave me stuff. So what I did, I gave all that information, all that material to the state archives, and I've got a little bit more as soon as the book's finished that I'm going to give to them.
Okay.
Because I don't want it to go in a dumpster.
Right.
Or whatever. And the reason I gave all the stuff to the museum, and none of the stuff down here was actually used in any crime, because you couldn't do that.
Right.
But all that stuff that I've collected over the years, I wanted that. I didn't want that stuff to be going out on eBay. I wanted it to stay where it should be.
Yeah.
You know?
So let me ask you this. And you've seen thousands of pieces, so this may be a hard question. What was your favorite piece that you found over the years? Do you have one that's a favorite or one that stands out more than the others? Well,
there's a couple of things. I collected quite a few of what they call line sticks, or the canes that the officers carried, the high-ranking officers carried them back when we had the lockstep years ago and the striped uniforms.
Yeah.
And we operated under the Auburn system where they had the silent system, and the officers would carry these line sticks that were flexible metal rods with the leather on. They looked like canes, but they were all made in the Sullivan Saddletree factory at the prison. And they were not only a defensive device because they were flexible, but they were carried kind of like a military person might carry a swagger stick.
Huh.
And then the other thing, I think one of them, I love some of the artwork that the offenders did. And there was an inmate named Gary Reynolds, and Gary died of leukemia. Gary was not a violent inmate at all. He made a bad mistake when he was younger, but he started out as a leather worker, and he advanced. You'll see some of the things that I donated downstairs that I actually had to purchase through MVE, but I had him do. He would take a postcard, and he would do in leather A-Haul.
Right.
In leather.
Right.
He also, you'll see downstairs a state seal that I paid $375 for, but it's the only one like it in Missouri. He carved the state seal out of oak.
Oh, wow.
And the bears in the seal were out of walnut standing out of the seal.
Wow.
The talent was absolutely tremendous.
Yeah.
And to me, it was worth paying $375 to get him to do that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you had to do it legally.
Right. That's where I got my first duty belt and everything. The inmates, they'd size you and make one, and then it went through the process, and you'd go up front and pick it up. I
decided that on some of the artwork that's going to be in the latest book, you'll see a little bit of it downstairs, but there was an inmate that had been professionally trained as an artist, and he was such a good artist that he painted one of the Missouri Supreme Court justices' official portrait, and it was fabulous.
Right.
And I had him paint his own self-portrait and some of the portraits of some of the other inmates like Gary Reynolds and some of those, because I didn't want them to be forgotten. And we'll have those in the latest book that's coming out, and you'll see the originals downstairs.
Yeah.
But he was that good. I mean, it was as good as a photograph.
Wow.
What he did.
That's great.
Yeah. An Oregon boot's another thing that I had. Went around the inmate's leg, and Warden Swinson, it had been used as a doorstop, and Warden Swinson had got it from another officer who had it at his house, and had been given to this officer years ago, and Warden Swinson gave it to me
Oh,
when
wow.
he retired.
Yeah.
And I have that downstairs.
Keep you from being able to run, basically, right?
They had two pieces, and they went around. There was a metal piece like a leg brace,
Mm-hmm.
and it attached to the heel of your shoe. And then this heavy piece went around like a collar,
Right.
and then you tightened them down, and then took the ratchet tighteners off, and then you had to swing your leg.
Oh,
and
wow.
you certainly weren't going to run.
No. Yeah. Or get over a wall, or
walk off, but you're not going to run.
Absolutely. So I know that you were instrumental. Missouri State Pen closed in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
September 15th.
Yeah. I know that you were a big advocate of keeping it open and making it a museum, which I think's been successful. I know everybody I've talked to in Missouri has been up here at least once. I know me and my friends have made a few trips. What's the future with the Missouri State Pen? Do you know, or are we still going to be able to keep it as a museum?
I know a little bit. Of course, I go off the city council in April. I term limit out because you can only serve 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
We'll serve by 8 years. I'm disappointed in one way because I think that things should have moved faster.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a cooperative endeavor between the city, the state, and the county.
Mm-hmm.
So there are plans, for it. 31 acres of the prison down where the lower yard was and all that, and where the industries were located, that is now city property.
Okay.
And it was turned over by the state to the city.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the museum's in this building, and this building's privately owned.
Okay.
Convention of Israel leases it, but it's privately owned. But the museum would be great over at the prison, say in A-Hall or whatever. However, and you'll see a lot of this in my book, I've got a whole section called EF3 and Beyond.
Mm-hmm.
And the EF3 is referring to the 2019 tornado that came through here and just decimated a lot of the prison.
Yeah.
Housing Unit 2 is structurally unsound.
Okay.
It actually ripped some of the steel frames out of the windows.
Oh,
and
wow.
Took the caps on top of the roof, the big, huge limestone caps, and threw them up against Housing Unit 3. Oh. It took the roof completely off A-Hall. And A-Hall's the oldest building over there.
Right.
Thanks to the Convention and Visitors Bureau, they spent about $800,000 putting the roof back on.
Oh, wow.
A-Hall. So we had the 2019 tornado, then we had COVID, and that shut down the tours and everything. So we were 2 years behind. The highest year we had on attendance was 2018, 33,000. Okay. This year, we got back up to a little over 30,000. So we're on the way back up, and we're able to take people back into A-Hall. But there's still a lot of cleanup that needs to be done in A-Hall. It could not have gone another year of freezing and thawing and rain. Right. It would have destroyed it.
Yeah.
And that would have been a tragedy. So there are plans for MSP. I know Corrections is talking about maybe if you look across the street where the old gym was,
right?
They're tearing that down. The state is, which needed to go because the tornado just demolished it too.
Right.
But Corrections has talked about building a corrections headquarters over there, and I'm not against that. No. I was always against us being on Plaza Drive for so long and leased property. We didn't have enough room. Probation, parole, as you know, scattered out all over. Everybody needs to be. Corrections is the second biggest state agency. We need to be all in one nice big house. So that's a good thing. Yeah. They're building 2 new labs down on Chestnut Street, and there will be an MSP Parkway that'll go down off the end of Lafayette down through where Supermax was. Okay. And it will go on and connect down on Chestnut, and that'll all be redone. And they're going to be spending about $200 million down on Chestnut. The money's already been approved. Right. They're building a new crime lab for the patrol down there and a new lab for some other state agencies.
Interesting.
So they're going to do some nice things. It's just a matter of us catching up and being able to do them.
Yeah. So I'd like to see the headquarters come over here. I think it would be nice to have that reminder of the history and where we came from.
Yep.
Right there.
And there needs to be a combination. If you go down, where 9 and 10 Tower were down there by the railroad.
Right.
It took the tornado took the wall out then.
Yeah.
It went through and took the wall, flattened it. Well, what we need to do is right here where 2 Tower is on the corner. We need to, if they want to step down the wall a little bit, we still need to keep the corners so everybody knows where the parameters of the institution were located.
Right.
And they will keep housing unit 1, H Hall. They will keep housing unit 4. They will keep housing unit 3.
Mm-hmm.
Those will be kept. And I think even the state parks is kind of looking at those a little bit. So those 3, if nothing else, definitely need to be kept.
Right. You've written or been part of and written the Shanks to Shakers, and you said the new one's coming out, which is Forgotten Shadows. So tell me a little bit about what, and you've mentioned it a little bit, but what got you to write Forgotten Shadows, and what are you can you give me a taste of what's going to be in there?
Since I'll be 77 in February, I finally came to grips with my mortality.
Okay.
Lack of immortality, at least in this one.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to do one last thing, and I wanted to include a lot of the things that have transpired with the demolition of the buildings over there. I took a lot of photos of the demolition. Here's what happens. After we pass, like my generation, I was looking at an E Squad picture the other day of some of the guys on E Squad that I was on E Squad with. And every one of the guys in this particular picture are dead.
Right.
And Don Beckley, Major Beckley, was the last one that died. He just died a few months back.
Yeah.
Every one of them's dead. Well, I can look at every person, and memories are made because of the people that we've known.
Sure.
A building's a building. It's what happened in that building and the people that made it happen that we remember. That's the history. That's where history is important, just like in our family. So when you have some written documentation and you try to be as accurate as possible, then if people still want to read a book, and I'm not sure in some ways how long books will be around, I hope I'm all for the computer and the iPad and all, but it's a wonderful thing to still be able to have a book.
I still like
it in your hand.
Yes.
And so what I'm hoping is that by these books existing somewhere in time, Shanks to Shakers and Forgotten Shadows, that if some young person goes to the library or goes to the archives or State Historical Society, they pick up that book or maybe find that book that their grandfather had and he worked at the prison or whatever, then they can look at that book and say, "Oh, that's really interesting."
Yep.
I mean, that's my hope. And so what I wanted to do is to kind of memorialize, and I think I use that term in there. I kind of want to memorialize some of these individuals that I knew, that I worked with.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying they were saints. None of us were.
No.
But I want to tell you, they made a great contribution to the citizens of the state of Missouri as far as protecting them. And corrections, as far as I'm concerned, corrections nationally, it's the forgotten profession.
Oh, absolutely.
It's the forgotten profession in the scale of the criminal justice system. And when I had students, one of the things that I did at Columbia College, most of my students were young people, young adults that a lot of them were already working in some phase of criminal justice.
Sure.
But what I did, I would bring them over to the old prison, and then I took them to the new prison, and then I would have them write a paper. What did you see as far as a comparison? Because that was a great classroom for them to see what a 19th century, early 20th century facility looked like that was antiquated.
Sure.
And then go to a brand new facility with 21st century technology and to see, okay, this isn't just a let's get away from the classroom sightseeing tour. What do you actually see? What did you see? What did you learn by observing, these various stages of correctional development?
Yep.
And so I think that's where that was the reason why I wanted to do the book and by showing the buildings being torn down, because later on, you know what, people get in an argument and they'll say, well, I know that building didn't sit there. Well, yeah, I did, because here it
Yeah.
shows it right in the picture.
Yeah.
And what I also have in this book, I got some lessons myself, because I had a couple of people that came on the tours that were people maybe my age, maybe a little bit older. And one of them had a great uncle that was one of the deputy wardens back when it was all political appointment. And by golly, she brought me some photographs that said I could use in the book that I had no idea.
Wow.
And I saw buildings that I had no idea ever existed, and they were 3 and 4-story buildings.
Yeah. Yep.
And nobody would remember those, but there was the proof right there that they did exist.
Yeah.
You know?
That whole 47 acres over there has been built on top of over and over.
Over and over and over
Yeah.
again. And of course, the prison, you know, altogether is over 140 acres. It goes all the way out almost to Ellis Porter Park.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So all that area where the DNR building is over there, and then all the way out, it goes like, my gosh, half a mile beyond the prison. And see where the women's prison was after they moved out of MSP. That was called State Farm Number 1. And I remember as a little kid, whenever we moved here from Springfield, driving by up there, and you could see the women out there, and they had a huge vegetable garden, and they'd be out there hoeing and trimming and doing all this stuff, you know.
And that's another example of history going by is Ren's Farm.
Yeah. Look at Ren's Farm.
93 flood.
Did it?
Yeah.
And I took, I think in the 93 flood, I took 800 and some pictures of Ren's, Jefferson City. A friend of mine was headed to Capitol Police, and he let me get up on top of the Truman Building. And those are the only photographs I know of that were shot from the Truman Building. I show a boat going up to the front of the Capitol Plaza Hotel. Yeah. The High Street Viaduct was the only way you could get into town. Uptown, everything else was underwater.
Right.
Another friend of mine, he got me up in the Capitol Dome, and I shot all down through Mill Bottom and all of that.
Yeah.
And took a lot of photos of the inmates cleaned up North Jeff City. They were the ones that cleaned up the airport. It was all our offenders, and they saved the city thousands of dollars.
Oh yeah.
All the inmates got. They paid them $7.50 a day instead of their $7.50 a month. And we had guys that could use loaders and everything else. And they got them at Hardee's or McDonald's every day. And those guys, we had no problem whatsoever.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. None. We had some inmates that came to me one day, and myself and a couple other guys were working over there, kind of supervising from central office. And they said, of course, they weren't guys from MSP. Some of them were LHAW guys outside, but they came and they said one day, they said, Mr. Schrieber, we've got a fellow that if you just walk around there just about 10 or 15 minutes when it's lunchtime, you'll see this guy, and he never wants to work. And we happen to know that he's made some contact with his girlfriend to pick him up. And by golly, all I did was I went around there and I saw who the guy was. I got his name. And what I just did, the next day, he didn't come out on out count. And that took care of the problem.
Right.
Because those guys, I had guys that found firearms, and they'd come and say, you need to come and look at this.
Right.
They didn't want to touch them. And they'd say, hey, thanks for telling us. But they were tremendous contributors, not only in the sandbagging early on, but in the cleanup aftermath of the Jeff City Airport and North Jeff City and everything. They did a tremendous
floating propane tanks over there. It was crazy.
They did. They were great to help.
The water, I remember the water was up over the railroad tracks, and we were kind of worried about the back wall, whether that'd get undercut.
Well, it's Militia Drive going out there to Algoma. Yeah. You got it all across there, and they sandbagged as long as they could, and then it finally became a exercise in futility.
Yeah.
Biggest
memory I have, I was running an inmate crew inside MSP there, and I'm leaning on a rail watching the inmates mop up the hallways because there was water everywhere, and lightning struck outside, and I felt it go through me, and I was like, whoa, we're done. We're up here in the dry.
So. Well, the night that the Missouri River came over and got into Ren's Farm, I was over there with Butch Gooden, and Butch Gooden was the fire safety officer over there, and Butch had retired from the Navy.
Mm.
In fact, my dad had him as a student at Jeff City High School. And Butch came to my dad and said, "Mr. Schrieber, what do you think I ought to do?" And my dad said, Butch was not noted for being a scholar.
Right.
And my dad said, "Well, now, Butch, if you could just get a C in this class," he said, "I've got just the place for you. You need to join the Navy." And Butch did. He stayed 20 years. But I'm going to tell you what, we bought a boat at Central Office through Don Gurley, and it was a big 60-inch wide boat. Had an inboard outboard, and we used it during the flood. Butch Gooden operated that boat, and that man, of course, we had on life jackets, but I've never felt safer in a boat. That guy could handle a boat like you would not believe. And when the water came over, it came over from up around 63 and then came in kind of like from the back side and then swung around. And boy, when it came.
Right.
And of course, it just wiped Renshaw out.
Yeah.
You know.
Actually, I have a little story from then, and it's when at one time you were in charge of all of our special teams.
Yes.
E Squad and C Star. I think that's when we first met. I was on C Star. But after Ren's Farm flooded the next few years, they allowed us to go over there and train inside that building. It was. And we trained over there like once a month, and we'd run our radios on mutual aid. And so one training, we decide, me and a buddy, and we go up through the control center because there was a hatch, went to the roof. So we go up there, and one of the other guys, they're looking for us. And so we snag him, pull him up on the roof. We're like, "Hey, we got a guy hostage up here. Now figure out what to do." And so we're talking all this stuff. Do you remember this?
I remember.
And so we're talking all this stuff on the radio, and we'd been doing this for months, but it had all been inside the building. And I'm sitting down there on top of the building, and I see this car just come flying down the dirt road, and it was you. And you're like, "Stop the exercise, stop the exercise." And people had been picking it up on mutual aid.
He said he was okay. Mr. Moore was.
Yeah.
He was a good guy. Mr. Moore just died. He was deceased.
We were embarrassed as could be, but yeah,
well, I wasn't mad. I just didn't want. I didn't want everybody descending on us.
Oh no!
Red lights and siren driving code to get to the exercise. And I thought, well, we should have probably told them what we were going to do, but I didn't think about it.
No, and we had done it for months.
Yeah, we had. We'd done several of them.
So good times.
Good times and great people.
Yes, we
had some great people. And when you look back. Go back to what happened in 1983 on July 3rd when the Aryan Brotherhood got out of control up at Moberly. They only had when I did the investigation on that, they only had 17 officers on duty for that institution.
Wow.
When that happened. Yeah. And close to 2,000 inmates.
Right.
17 officers. And it's a wonder that whole facility wasn't lost. It really was.
But that's what built the relationships, and I still have relationships from people that worked at MSP. And, well, even beyond that, if I just see somebody these days that worked at MSP, we automatically have that bond. And it's because of some of those dangerous times. There was nobody else to depend on. It's only you inside that wall and the people that you work with.
That's right.
And I think that works for all of corrections, not just here, but here there was enough going on that you built that rapport very quickly and that trust very quickly.
We're in the process now of the police department here and they're very well equipped, but we're in the process of getting body cameras. And of course, it's not, we've had people from the public saying, well, why don't they already have them? Well, that you've been saying you're going to get them, and we the city council, we appropriated the money and everything, but it's not the cameras so much. It's the issue of the storage. And you have to have an employee that's trained that can take care of all of that and keep it and be ready to go to court and all that. So we're working all that out. But I remember whenever we first got video cameras. And at first it was like, get that video camera out of here. Well, then later on, guess what? It became, where's the video camera?
Right.
Because everybody found it on use of force, and if you were trying to get somebody to throw a knife out of his cell, and you're getting ready to have to send a movement team in to get him out, and then we got it well organized to where you said, okay, I'm the team leader, and this is Officer so and so. He'll take the right arm. This officer's going to take the left arm, and on down the line,
Right.
so on and so forth. And it got to where that I can't tell you how much that saved us going to court to show what the inmate was doing, how they failed to obey lawful commands. And it's just like the use of force reports themselves. I used to tell, I had to review all those at central office, and I would say, folks, look, a use of force report can't be a mirror image. If you and I are on the same group of people,
Right.
the time might be the same, but everything's going to be a little different. I'm not looking for somebody, and I had one captain. I won't mention his name, but he was a good captain. He's now deceased. And Mr. Moore called me in one time, the director, and he wanted this captain. At first, he wanted him fired. And I said, well, Mr. Moore, I said, Mr. Armatrout and I can tell you that this fellow's a good captain. And he said, yeah, but he's involved in too many serious use of force, blah, blah, blah. And we said, well, I want you to look at it this way. Here's what my investigation shows. That's true. He is. But guess what? He's assigned to Supermax.
Yeah.
104 single man cells, the worst of the worst, the Hannibal Lecter personalities,
right.
The guys that none of the other inmates want to be around.
Right.
And he said, oh, I never looked at it that way. And so he said, okay, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'll tell you what we're going to do. That guy's probably been there too long in it. We transferred him out to Algoa. He was madder than a hornet that he had to go to Algoa. But then you know what? About a year later, he came, we were out there, and he said, I just want to tell you guys, I never knew what it was like. Thank you for transferring me.
Right.
First he was mad, and it was like, thank you so much for transferring me.
Yeah.
Because he was caught in that, and that was our fault. That was the fault of his supervisors. I was at central office at the time, but that should have been recognized.
Yeah.
And then when the director realized what the real reason was, it's because this is the guy that had to take care of the problems.
Right. Right. You talked about video cameras. I got to tell you this story too, real quick. Missouri State Pen, it had to have been like May of '93. We had a disturbance over here, probably one of the bigger ones I've been in. Lost 3 building for a little bit, and I was staying on the lower yard, keeping inmates on the yard from getting back up there with the others. But it was kind of spilt out in front of the captain's shack and stuff. And the deputy warden at that time, can't remember his name, but he said, go get video cameras. Go get all the video cameras. And they started putting them up on the top floors so everybody could get this video camera and the inmates could see them with the video cameras. And that worked. I mean, they didn't want to get on that video camera, and they were disappearing left and right. But after it was done, the guys told me that the video cameras that had tape in them didn't have a battery, or the ones that had a battery didn't have tape in them, but nobody knew. It didn't matter. Everybody thought they did.
Yeah.
And so, it stopped the problem we were having, and we went and took those back. I
remember one time when I can't remember the exact year, it was in the 80s, and we had a work strike over there. And the inmates broke into the lower yard down there where they had a bunch of tools to cut weeds and all that. And they got a hold of all these tools, rakes and shovels, and they came up, and they were right at the door on the upper yard, up there right at the 2-house door.
Right.
And they were all ganged up and everything. Well, the warden at the time, he told me, he said, Mark, would you get your camera? I had a 35 millimeter camera, which is what I used for crime scenes and stuff. And he said, would you get up on the tower and photograph those guys? Well, the deal was, as this is a typical offender trick that they do, the old guys were the ones that were egging everybody on. They were standing in the back.
Sure.
They put the hothead young guys, just like what we were talking about with some of the staff.
Right.
They were up in the front. So, so when I did the photography, I got a lot of the old guys over here standing back in the back talking, and we were able to identify them. And so what we did, then violations were written on them, and guess what? We took a bunch of them, we shipped them all over everywhere.
Right.
Yeah. Some of them we even sent out of state on interstate compact, because they were the ones that were stirring the pot, so to speak.
Sure, absolutely.
It's kind of like people asked about interstate compact, and I said, well, yeah, but let me tell you something, how that works.
Right.
You send somebody that you want out of the system because they're a real pain.
Hmm.
But I said, you can bet that if you get somebody from them, they're going to be a real pain.
Yeah, it's a trade.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
trade.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, if people want to get a hold of your books, where can they get those at?
Well, the existing both those books now are sold out. The last bunch of books sold out early in the tourist season this year.
Okay.
They can probably find them in libraries. Occasionally, you'll find a Somewhere in Time book on eBay or something like that. But like I said, the Forgotten Shadows book with documentation, and I think I've got 8 or 9 chapters in the new book. They're not real long chapters, but each one has an introduction leading into the chapter, what it's about, why it's significant, and everything like that. So, and then I've got some poems that have been written. I've got some really nice artwork and some prison cartoons that some of the inmates did. One of the first fellows that I ran into, I actually at one time was an art major and a speech major until I switched over to criminal justice. And so I had a student at MSP back in the early 1970s when I was an officer.
Mm-hmm.
I taught in classroom number 5 in housing unit 5, and that's where the school was.
Right.
The school wasn't where it was later built in 1980.
Right.
Well, I had an inmate named Sammy Reese, and Sammy came from St. Louis. He came in very, very young as a teenager, and originally they were trying to get the death penalty. Well, Sammy was one heck of an artist, and he was good at doing prison cartoons, and he did a bunch of them for the Jefftown Journal, prison newspaper.
Right, right.
Well, we didn't. I had to change out of my pickle green uniform, so ugly, with my bus driver cap, and I had to put on civilian clothes to go teach because they didn't want me teaching in a uniform.
Right.
Well, the inmates for a long time thought I had a twin brother until they figured out it was the same guy. Well, anyway, so Sammy was there, and I would go up to Bartlett's store which was across from the courthouse. It's nothing but a vacant lot now because it burned later on, and that's where I would buy the art supplies. Well, about the only thing that we could afford was we'd get India ink and the pens and all that, and I'd get paper for them, get pretty good quality paper. And Sammy would draw these cartoons about prison life, and he had it down, and he would take toilet paper and roll it across them to blot them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've got some of his cartoons in my book because I ended up buying them, and I ended up buying some of them because, and he did hundreds of them at one time. Warden Swinson called me up to his office one day. He said, Mr. Schrieber. Yes, sir, Warden. Sammy Reese is a pretty good artist, isn't he? And I said, yes, sir, he's a very good artist. I'll tell you how good he was. Life magazine did a story on it.
Oh, okay.
And that's back when Life magazine was the magazine.
Right.
Well, anyway, so he said, yeah, Schrieber, that's the trouble. He's too damn good.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, Warden, what's the problem? He said, well, some of these cartoons that are up there on the novelty stand, I don't want those sold. He said, I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because they're a little bit too strong in the message they're sending. Well, what it was, like one of them would say, show somebody being led to the gas chamber, and the inmate said, and now at the hour of our death, cha cha cha. Another one said, asked this inmate, you got a quarter for a yellow jacket, mister? Of course, which was narcotic,
right.
Yeah. And so Sammy had this rather sarcastic approach, and it wasn't necessarily aimed at the staff. It was he was making fun of the inmates too. Well, the warden didn't like it.
Yeah.
So I ended up buying some of the ones that I've still got. I'll eventually give them here to the museum.
Yeah.
But so that was done, from Sammy Reese. So
interesting.
And Sammy got out, ended up dying of natural causes, but he was one heck of an artist.
Wow.
Yeah.
So. Is Forgotten Shadows up for pre-sale or anything?
No pre-sales, but what people can do later on in April and all, when it's announced and when it come out, I'll let you know.
Okay.
And then it'll be sold through the Convention and Visitors Bureau here.
Okay.
and I think the price is probably going to remain about the same. I think it'll probably be about 160 pages,
Okay.
and it'll be professionally done by Walsworth Printing up in Marceline, Missouri, which is one of the best printing companies anywhere in the United States. They do stuff for the Naval Academy and the Air Force
Oh, wow.
Academy and
Yeah.
all kinds of things. So I always wanted the books to be high quality, high grade. So I think it'll be probably in the around $20 range, which most people can afford.
Sure.
You know, so
Yeah, let me know. I'll add a link to the show notes here.
yeah.
Do you want to leave any contact information if somebody wanted to contact you?
If somebody wants to contact me directly, they can reach me at if they want at ms and then Schrieber Schreiber 46 at gmail.com.
Okay.
And they can get a hold of me that way. And if they would like to, and I ask them to do one thing: leave me your phone number.
Right.
So if I want to call you and talk to you, I still do it the old-fashioned way, and I will be glad to call. And if they've got issues or questions, they can send me the question on email, and I will call them or contact them back. But please send me their phone number.
Excellent.
Okay.
I can't thank you enough for agreeing to do this. I've been looking forward to it for a long time, and you're just a wealth of information, and I appreciate you sharing it with the listeners.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing, and I apologize that it's taken me so long. It's like back and forth, my fault. But we finally got it done.
We got her done.
I'm going to do it before something else comes up, and then I can't do it. Yep. So,
Well, thank you, Mark.
Thank you, and thank you for your service to the corrections. I appreciate it.
I appreciate
all
that.
of our people are important. Every single corrections staff person, and I hope they're not forgotten, and I hope that they continue to put the profession forward and to try to raise it up on the spectrum in the criminal justice.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Good words. Yes, thank you. If you enjoy these podcasts, the best way to support the Prisoner Officer Podcast is to share these episodes with your friends or family on social media. Let me invite you to visit www.theprisonofficer.com. If you haven't already, check out the Prison Officer Podcast on Facebook and click that little follow button. Or leave us a message, or better yet, leave us a review. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify, please click the subscribe button. Till next time, I'm Mike Cantrell. Watch your back, and please take care of each other out there behind those walls.